to Missional Design, Startup Tools for Churches. My name is Tobias Treppmann, and I live in Berlin, Germany. My background is in theology, but I've been working in the tech sector for a long time. And today I'm excited to share with you some of my explorations of what the church might be able to learn from the startup world. Over 20 years ago, a neighboring church was able to secure a plot of land in my hometown and decided to build a new property. The architect mentioned that the neighboring property was a trade school, in that, when you walk by there, you see a lot of students during the breaks or, when they're out of class, just hanging out and lingering outside the front door on the campus with nowhere else to go. It's not a very accessible area. There is no grocery stores, no little corner shops or anything else. And so they just hang out there and smoke. So the idea was, why don't we reach out to those students if we're already moving into a new neighborhood? And wouldn't that be a great way to serve the new area that we're going into? And there was a lot of excitement about that idea, and they said, hey, let's make a coffee shop for those students so they can have a place where they can go and we can reach out to them. They rallied and mobilized volunteers. They invested into coffee makers and all the things that you need for a ministry like that. And then they opened after they completed construction. Now, this is not a negative example per se. The coffee shop is still open today after over 2 decades failure, but to me this is a great example for how we tend to go about projects. We get excited about a vision, a certain group of people, a neighborhood, some way we want to serve, and then we immediately have an idea on how we want to do that. And then we work hard, we mobilize people, we put in the hours and the sweat and the tears to make this vision a reality. But we don't stop to think or to validate whether this is going to work. We build up to this big reveal, this opening day, and then we're praying that people will come and then this will be an effective ministry. But it doesn't always work that way, and the longer something takes to build up, the harder it is to let go of that, or the harder it is to deal with that if it doesn't in fact work out. And I've seen that in myself, but I've also seen that with fellow friends that went to seminary with me who did go into full-time ministry. They would find themselves in a ministry that had never really reflected on the efficacy of their model of how they're doing things, because they're already doing it in the proven way, right? This has worked 20 years ago, it worked 10 years ago. This is the way to do it. We know our audience, we know how to do this type of ministry. And say they would come into that and just assume that this is the way to do things and have a really hard time, not see any fruit. Work harder and even harder, and come to the point of burnout, come to the point of disillusionment, and eventually leave the project. But some of them were so invested mentally, emotionally, spiritually, that something like that not working out came with much severe consequences. They ended up leaving the ministry altogether. Some of them even left the faith behind because of their utter disappointment and the hardship that they faced. Well, what I think a lot of times could have been preventable. There are 2 problems with this general approach, with falling in love with this project idea and then just going after it. What tends to happen is a lack of differentiation between the different aspects of the work, right? Between the mission, the vision, the strategy, and the action plan. We all lump it together, and that's problematic. The second one is, with this approach, you don't really know what works until you've opened the doors, until it's opening day, because you're so excited and so sure that it works that you're putting all your effort and resources into building the whole thing until you can launch. Does it sound familiar? Maybe it does. I've certainly been part of many projects where that was the operating procedure. And when we do that, this is what that looks like, right? So we don't differentiate. It's all one big blob of this type of ministry. And that usually tends to lead to resource-intensive structures, and not very often is there a reflection on the model itself, on how are we doing things, why are we doing things, right? Now, I call this missional design because design ultimately, in its essence, means doing things intentionally and making sure that they serve a purpose. That is a very important thing, is to continually and repeatedly reflect on what you're doing, why you're doing it in the first place, and whether or not that still works for you today. Now, there is a positive example in the Bible. We have of the Apostle Paul on his second missionary journey. He had his MO. He would go, through the different cities, the diaspora cities, and follow his path. At some point, the Holy Spirit told them no. Acts 16, verses 6 to 10. Instead of despairing and saying, oh, this whole thing doesn't work anymore, maybe I'm not even called to be the apostle to the Gentiles anymore, he had a plan B. He pivoted a little bit and went a different direction. And then the same thing happened again. He was already going north, and he thought, well, we might as well keep going. The Holy Spirit prevented them from doing that, which ultimately led them to Troas, where then there was supernatural intervention, and in a dream, God called them over to Macedonia. And that's just a small aside. I mean, that is something that in ministry we have access to. We have access to a holy God, an all-powerful God, who can intervene in supernatural ways. So in addition to what we might be able to learn, from the marketplace, there's definitely unique things that we bring to the table as well. As Christians, as people in ministry or missions. If he had equated mission, vision, strategy, and his action plan, he would have had a big problem when things didn't work out anymore, right? He would have asked himself the question, am I even really called to be the apostle to the Gentiles? But that's not what happened, because he was able to differentiate on those levels. He had to adjust his action plan, and that was pretty much it. Now, of course, if that had happened a lot more frequently, and there was a lot more failure, if you will, maybe he would have started changing his strategy or reflecting on that. But there was no need to do that, because he was able to differentiate from the beginning. And so he went about, and he had his general working approach, went from city to city, but then obviously in each city, he needed to contextualize the gospel and his approach, and did that over and over and over again, because every time the context was different. And that's something that we experience as well in these rapidly changing times, that you don't even have to travel anywhere else for your context to change, right? Whether that be due to gentrification, changing city dynamics, whether that be, social or economic shifts or technological innovations that change the complete landscape, that change how we do things, how we look at life as a society. Within a few years now, what used to take decades, if not centuries, is happening every couple of years now. And we need to respond as a church. If we want to be faithful ministers to the gospel and serve our neighbor, then we need to be cognizant of that and need to respond to that. And we're not alone. The same is true for the business world. To stay competitive today, it's not enough anymore to just keep tweaking here and there and to add yet another camera to your phone, or to make your vacuum cleaner, suck air even faster. That was enough 50 years ago. That is not secure survival even for companies anymore today. So we need to think bigger. We need to continually reflect, not just on our product, on our service, but even on our whole model. How do we do things as a business or as a ministry, as a church? These visualizations side by side. So on the left-hand side, we have what we just talked about. And there are some biblical examples of that being the right thing and the right approach. For example, the building of the temple, or Noah's Ark. Right? Clear instructions. What they have in common is that there is little uncertainty in those situations. And there are still situations and projects and initiatives today where we're dealing with little uncertainty. And it's perfectly fine then to go about it that way, to make an intentional, a smart plan, get all your resources together, and then go and build it, and they will come. More often though, that's not the case anymore. We're dealing with a lot more uncertainty. And so looking at St. Paul's mission, looking at startup ecosystem today, who are trying to compete in this markets where there is extreme uncertainty, or even just our societies and our ministries in their given context. Whenever there's a high degree of uncertainty, where there's a lot of change, and we need to find clarity, we need to find what works, it is so incredibly helpful and healthy to differentiate between those things, to stick to the vision and the mission. We want to serve those trade school students. Maybe a coffee shop is exactly what we're supposed to do, and is the most effective way to serve those trade school students. But maybe there's something else that we learn along the way that would serve them even better, that would be more effective, and we will be much better stewards over time, energy, and resources with much greater impact and results. Now, I work in the software scene. I work for a startup that makes big data software, and I'm a software designer. And we have a mantra that we repeat over and over and over again in this space, and that is fall in love with the problem, not the solution. And it's the essence of what I love about this approach. And what I've found so counterintuitive to how I go about ideas that I have, and in general as societies and organizations, we tend to do things, but it is so helpful to take a step back, to identify our vision, our mission, and then the model and the idea of the solution that we have in mind, and not lump them together and treat them as the same thing. Other things in this context that I find very helpful to remind myself of, when all of this kind of is an innovation topic, a good idea does not equal success. But on the other hand, innovation and doing things differently, that doesn't automatically mean that it's very risky. In fact, the lean startup approach that we're going to look at in just a minute is one of the best risk management methods today. The other thing that's not true is that innovation has to be very expensive. And then a good reminder for me as a software designer is always that innovation does not automatically mean that it has to be something digital. Startups today have a lot in common with churches. They have a small team, they have few resources, they don't have much time, don't have a lot of money, but they want to go out and change the world. And that's exactly what ministries are trying to do, right? And we're all serious about that. And yet for the startup, they have a very time-boxed setup where they raise some money, a seed round, and that buys them about a year of runway to develop their idea further and see if it works. And they just cannot afford to fall in love with that first solution and go build that. Usually, those tend to be very complex, right? Those tend to be very involved because you dream big. And to just build that one thing and then hope that it will work out. And the lean startup approach is a fantastic answer to that helps us avoid that. But we still should dream big. We should think big, but we'll start small. And then when we know it works, we can scale fast and make progress. So, what does this iteration look like? This iterative approach of not just building the one idea, then obviously you have to have several. Well, this is the first good example of that. This is an incredibly popular graphic. Everybody in software development at least has seen at some point. But I still find it a fantastic illustration of this approach. We're not building and getting together all the individual pieces that make up the car in the end. Instead, we try to iteratively provide a solution that we can take out to the customer and get some feedback that we have them use, and it solves the problem of mobility just enough, or maybe in the beginning not even quite enough. But we get the feedback, we can learn from that, we can take the next step. And as we learn and experiment, we come to a much higher level of certainty about the needed solution, the effective solution, and we end up with a car. And as you notice, the car does look a little bit different from the original idea shown above. Ultimately, This is the startup cycle, and it's really just the scientific method. The startup cycle is based on the build, measure, learn cycle. You build a minimum viable product, like that skateboard, and then you test it out, you give it to some people, see how they respond to it, does that work for them, and then you observe and you learn, you get feedback, and then you devise your next experiment, and you keep going in those loops. It's called validated learning, and you kind of iterate and learn your way forward to something that works. You understand, where were we right, where were we not right, what do we have to change for the next experiment. And the same is true if we apply this in a ministry context. So let's stay with the startup initially. This to me is a helpful illustration and summary of this whole process. You start with an idea. At that point, high uncertainty. And then you use a business model canvas, or in our case, I've adapted that specifically for churches and ministries. You use a canvas as a tool to summarize your idea of your model of your ministry in a holistic way, from a financial perspective, from a target audience perspective, from a resources perspective, and everything in between. It's an incredibly helpful tool for businesses as well as for ministries to capture and document your initial idea of a project. And then you take your next step, you identify the leap of faith assumptions. And that's actually a step back, not a step forward. With most projects, there are some assumptions that we're taking for granted, but if they turn out not to be true, the whole thing falls apart. The student coffee shop banks on the fact that the students actually want something else to do during their breaks, that they would like some coffee. They might be willing to go to a coffee shop and maybe even pay money for a coffee. Even if the first parts are true, but they're not willing to pay for coffee, well, that's also good to know, right? Because then you need to switch up your funding there a little bit. But you identify those things, those really risky assumptions, and then as your next step, you focus exclusively on those assumptions. And you try to validate them, you try to devise experiments that are as cheap, as fast, and as effective as possible to make sure that you find out whether or not those assumptions are true. And they can align with your idea of your project and what you're trying to build, but they don't necessarily have to. Sometimes there's creative ways where you can validate those things without spending a lot of time, without even necessarily having to be too involved in the topic. If we look at that for the ministry example, the student cafe, you could do the same thing, right? So leap of faith assumptions, do they even want coffee, right? Or what are really their challenges or their needs when it comes to being on campus and maybe not having access to all that much. You could do an interview. Well, you could just prototype a coffee stand. You brew one coffee pot and you just show up with a little sign. It's like, hey, $1 coffee. And then you try selling that, and you can talk to some students, get some more feedback. It's like, hey, we have this idea of maybe we want to, open a coffee shop. What do you guys think of that? And you get really good feedback. And how quick and easy would that be to brew a pot of coffee and just show up there one day? Then maybe one of their challenges was that while the properties were next to each other, to actually get from the school to the church building, you actually have to walk around the block a little bit. It's not very obvious. You can't see it directly. So one of those assumptions would be that people are actually willing to do that. And that could be simulated by maybe setting up a few tables, right? Make a little mini cafe, assuming the church building wasn't built yet, right? You experiment with that and do it around the corner. You just put up a sign that says, hey, now the coffee shop's around the corner. And then you learn again. You get some feedback. You learn what worked, what didn't work. And maybe you're on the right track. It's like, this is enough information. We're confident. There's interest. There clearly is a need. People want something like that. They really responded well. We should do this. Let's put in a coffee shop. Or maybe you find out in those conversations that, well, they got a coffee maker inside. That's not really the big issue that they're having, but they are kind of suffering from being a little bit isolated and not in a not very accessible location. By the time they get home, the day is pretty much over, right? And they don't have any ability to kind of play sports or go to the gym or anything like that. And right across from their entrance is a big soccer field. Nobody ever plays there. So maybe you change your strategy and explore that and offer something here and do some sports ministry. Again, this is a fictional example, right? It's a real church and their coffee shop is doing well. They're faithful in their ministry. It struck me as a great example of that approach, and that's why I use that to kind of illustrate these processes here. This is the ministry model canvas that I've adapted from the business model canvas. If you're interested in that, you can find that on my website, ratio.co. And this is how the whole process starts, right? It's a fantastic tool to capture your initial idea and look at it holistically. You actually, go through all the different steps and different aspects of it and document that, and it really boils it down into something very tangible, very concrete. It's mission driven. It starts with the needs of the people you're trying to serve. It doesn't start with your own needs or with your financial resources or anything like that, but it starts with missional design. Let's, do missional activities intentionally. Let's shape them in intentional ways. And I've been doing that with some churches and ministries in the last couple of years, and it's proven to be a really effective way to, help churches that are in a season of change or that are trying to engage new projects or new target audiences for church plants and missionaries. Anytime a church or a ministry is faced with a season of uncertainty, this is a very helpful approach to identify a path forward.